Okay. Hello and welcome to yet another yeah, but yeah, learning should never stop. So again, we bring another session for you. This time we are talking about Sitecore Globalization, and we have with us an expert, Mr. Dan Schoenberg. Dan, speaking of Dan, he is one of an expert working with horizontal integration. He is a two-time MVP. He brings a vast IT experience behind him, like 11 plus years of experience. So let's hear what he has to say about Sitecore Globalization. We are trying to do this session a bit more differently. When we say different, we are not trying, this time we are not doing a code demo or something. It's just a expert panel question and answers session where we will be asking questions to Dan about psychoglobalization, about multi-sites, multi-languages, how we can set it up, how Sitecore supports it all. So this is like more of an interactive session for Q&A. At the end of the session, you can also go ahead and ask your questions to the expert. Just tweet your questions to the hash Sitecore Globalization, and we will pick up your questions and then we'll try to answer them at the end of this session. So I will hand it over the session to Dan.
Said we have a couple of questions and answers prepared. Quickly taking you through what we've learned through experience on a couple of projects related to globalization. One thing to keep in mind is that this obviously doesn't account for client-specific needs, so it may need to change if a client has specific requirements. But overall, just things to keep in mind, very important lessons that we've learned along the way in dealing with globalization. So with that said,
yeah, so let's start with the first question. Then, what do you mean by globalization? We know Sitecore is like a big enterprise level system, a platform where most of the enterprise, they invest in that. But how does Sitecore support globalization? What do we mean by globalization?
Sure. So globalization under this context could mean a number of different things. The strategies and patterns that we'll see in this presentation really covers whenever you're trying to set up multi-tenant sites within Sitecore, support multiple languages, when you have similar site sharing content, or really anytime you're trying to get more than one site into Sitecore, that could be covered by this. Globalization, I guess as a broader term, where you'll be using Sitecore to support sites in multiple regions with multiple languages, but that the scope of this could cover more than that. If you had a single country with multiple sites in it, the same learnings in this document would apply there.
Thank you for that, Dan. And then moving on to our next question: huge system, huge platform. Again, what is in for a normal developer or a normal content author in there out of the box that Sitecore provides us for globalization?
Sure. So by default, when you install Sitecore, it comes with a lot of tools that are designed to enable you to help the globalization process of our site, or support multiple sites. Things like how Sitecore has multiple languages supported on an item, how Sitecore has language fallback. You can support multiple sites and multiple languages through their site definitions, things like shared and final layout. And then the workflow and security also has an eye towards configuring support for multiple language or multiple groups of users. These are all tools that are designed to help you build a solution, but Sitecore doesn't dictate how these tools can be used, and you can combine them in many different ways. Obviously, with other areas of Sitecore, you've seen that they've left that implementation open to the partners or open to the developers working on it. So what we've tried to define is, how do we use all of these tools? What are some of the best practices for taking things like language versions or language fallback, and how do we apply them to a solution in a repeatable and maintainable fashion? Not so much what the tools are, but what do you make with the collection of these tools?
And being an enterprise, like I am an organization, I am an enterprise. I got Sitecore, then I started building up, my websites on Sitecore. But then, usually most of the organizations, most of the implementation partners, they come up with some concerns and some considerations. So, what do you suggest? What should be, the most common concerns we have seen while building such enterprise level websites?
Sure. So when you're starting a project, a global Sitecore solution, or if you're maintaining one or maybe updating an existing solution to support multiple regions or new languages, the first concern that you should have is the end user. The visitor to your site should be first and foremost the priority. And hopefully all of your decisions drive to make that experience better. Usually it's fine to sacrifice some things on the content authoring side if it makes the end user experience better. That said, one of the main considerations to keep in mind when planning out Sitecore is how you're going to reuse content, and that really goes to the entry of the content creation and the content maintenance process. The easier a content author's life is when maintaining or creating content, the more time they have to do other things like personalization or testing or just any of the other things that they do with their job. The more time that they have to spend clicking to create items or push things through workflow or whatnot, that's just time that they have to spend. So the ability to create content, easily maintain that, and then share that content with other related sites or other related business units is something that you should be considering when building out your content tree or structuring that. Another part of the consideration process, especially when you get into Sitecore solutions that support multiple regions, is governance. How is the content going to be governed? Who is going to need to approve the content? Who can edit content where? We've seen a number of different examples. One where content was centrally managed and then each of the regions were responsible for approving it. We've seen it the other way around, where each of the regions authored the content and then it was centrally approved. Or we've seen it where each of the regions were responsible for maintaining and managing their own content, and it was really left up to them to determine what content was appropriate for their region and their site. And those are all three different options or three different ways that you would configure governance and Sitecore security or workflow, all very dependent on the client's needs in those early discussions, but something that's very important to discuss and think about upfront. The final piece I wanted to call out on this to consider is how do you build out expandability? How do you make it easy to put some flexibility in the process? As we all know, different regions, different areas of the world are going to have different needs. Additionally, if there's support in one region, let's say you're building out an e-commerce site or something like that, a product may roll out to one region first and then another region. So you'll need some flexibility in building out not only the business process if there's checkout concerns for a new project, but also to roll out features or have features be slightly different, because different markets, different regions might have different requirements, either legal requirements or just how the business operates in that region, or cultural differences there. So.
Okay. Now, then what should we consider? What should we think about? Like whenever a website is coming up, we will go through a content architecture exercise. Most of partners, they try to do that. What should be considered while we are building the content tree structure just for globalization implementation?
Yep. So I kind of hinted at it before, but when you're setting up the content tree, the biggest consideration that will help your content authors is identifying where content can be reused and duplicated, and where the divisions might be for the governance and workflow. So I have a little sample here of a content tree that was just put together for demo purposes, but a pattern that we've seen some success with. So we'll have our sites grouped together. So we might have the US site, which would support, US English, and we might have an EU site that would support a number of different languages. Within the content tree for the US site, we'll have content and components that would be specific to the US site. Now, these may be specific in the fact that the content in them speaks to concerns that the US people would have, whereas the EU people would never have a need for that content. Or the content within the US site may be driven based off requirements that are only specific to the US site. So this content couldn't even technically be used on another site. Similar with the EU site. And then at the same level of the US site and the EU site, we have this shared folder. So you have content at a site-specific level, and then you have a content at kind of this more global level. And this would be where content could be entered for that could be used both on the EU as well as the US site could be populated there. This model kind of balances between allowing each team complete flexibility and locking each team in together. So what we're looking at here, the US site and the EU site could have totally different site maps. You can create sites based on their needs. There is the ability to share component content. You would need to assemble that and composite that onto a page. But if a piece of content was created, if imagery was added, if content was imported into one of these folders, that would be available for reuse. Now, we'll get to it in a second, but a big part of the content reuse is making sure that content is available in the language that you're trying to reuse it. So we'll get to that portion in a second, but if you have an item defined that or created that defines a specific data entity, it's very clear where the content should be reused, and at that point, it's up to getting the translations in. The other portion of this is that this can be expanded out another level. So in this case, we're looking at just the corporate sites, which would be the US site and the EU site. If we had another set of sites that would be present in the Sitecore solution, we could essentially take this same folder structure, the same Sitecore content tree, and make a similar duplicate of it for those new sites. Again, you could have the US site, the EU site, or completely separate sites with shared content between them, with shared content between that site group. And then you could create a component folder at a higher level that could share across all of the sites. It really, at that point, kind of depends on the look and feel of each site, as well as if there's any specific requirements, or if the design would even support sharing of content. So, all right.
Okay. And the next question, or maybe I am working on an intranet where all my earlier intranet website was on a SharePoint, and I just want to get all that content now into Sitecore, and then related to globalization. So, what are my ways? How can I get those content in Sitecore?
Sure. So when you're working on a Sitecore, a global Sitecore solution that's intended to support multiple regions and multiple languages, usually that's the first time the enterprise has tried to address that directly, having all of the sites supported by a single platform and a single code base. What's usually found is that there's some backend systems like SAP or PRM and ERP that has information in it, but it doesn't have information that will support all of the different languages that you're trying to identify. And this isn't just the content that you're consuming, but it could also be the integration. So if you need to call a web service when a user takes an action and, I don't know, upload a form or something there, that doesn't always support all of the different languages. What we've seen, or the other case, is when you're pulling together two sites, like if we're adding the US site and an English site, or an Indian site onto the same Sitecore platform. The current state is both of those countries could be using a different system on there, and you'll need to merge that system together. One of the ways that we've seen that is if the system that you're integrating with doesn't support the languages or doesn't support the regions that the Sitecore site will need to, is we would pull that content in, import it into Sitecore so that an entity exists in Sitecore that would reference back to the external system, and then essentially manage the content on that item within Sitecore. So we would have a reference to the original content in there, but then the marketers would be able to append, you'd append fields to it, and the marketers would be able to go in and create the translated content, add imagery for it. If you are integrating with other systems, one of the things that you'll have to consider or determine is, how do you differentiate between the different systems that you'll be integrating with? Is that built into the site definition? Is that a configuration node somewhere? How do you know if you're integrating with the US system, the Canada system, whatnot, and where do you build those differences? It may seem like a trivial discussion, but it's something that you'll want to build early, and then you'll have to live with throughout the project. So kind of understanding those deltas or those swap points are important. The other thing to call out that I feel like isn't always used, but if you're importing from another system and you're holding on to, say, the primary key in that other system, look at using shared fields, especially if there is any sort of governance or workflow in the other system. If you're basically consuming from the other system and they're saying this content's already been approved, we don't want it to go through any sort of additional workflow, look at how that ties into your import process and how your data is structured within Sitecore. So.
Okay. I think I just ignored one person. Varun. Hey Varun. For multiple languages when we are talking about the globalization.
Sure. So this is always seems to be a sticking point when we get to actually delivering the site. Getting anyone that's worked on a Sitecore site or really a CMS site before knows how much effort can go into just getting the initial content populated for a single language. Now, when you're talking about multiple languages, you're essentially multiplying that effort by 2 or 3. When we get into setting up translations or getting other language content added, there's a number of different ways that this can be handled. So a big ask that we hear about when building this out is a client getting a translation service or integrating with some third-party provider for translations. There are a couple of different options for this. So the first option is a translation service could use some sort of programmatic approach or machine learning to perform a translation from language A to language B. That's usually straightforward. Everyone grasps that. It has a fairly low cost, a fairly quick turnaround time, but at the same time, if you've ever spent some time with Google Translate, as good as it is, it leaves the quality lacking a little bit. From there, if that's unacceptable, there's other options where a service could have an actual human reading the origin language and translating it to the destination language and managing that way. Obviously, that costs a little bit more. It's a lower turnaround time, but it also has a much higher quality, or the end results will be much better. In either of those options, there's a desire or a preference to build that into your workflow. So if someone, if we're translating from language A to language B, if someone enters new content or makes a change to content A, you would want to automatically trigger the translation process, exporting the content from Sitecore to this third-party service. And then when that third-party service is done with the translation, updating the language B version in Sitecore to what the language translation service provided. At that point, a discussion needs to be done with the client, with the product owner, on if there is one final set of review, or does that just go live? What is the governance and workflow around that? A lot of different ways to automate this, and they're all technically feasible. It's just what works best for the client, for their organization, and they're really their needs for the translation and how accurate that needs to be. The final option that I wanted to discuss, which is something that I feel like in recent years is gaining more and more traction, is there are new translation services that will essentially sit in front of your site. And as requests come in, they'll request a page, and they'll act in a similar manner to a CDN. They will take the outputted page, translate that, and then host or cache that on their service, and then use that page to serve traffic. It's something that is being brought up. It solves a couple of issues. It's a fairly low-cost alternative. However, there are a lot of concerns around what that does for some of Sitecore's marketing features. If clients aren't hitting the Sitecore service directly, but instead they're getting a cached HTML page on another platform, how do you account for things like personalization? How do you account for all of the analytics? Those are still questions that need to be solved, but if you're in these discussions around that service, just be aware of those and talk through them as you go.
So I think you have already covered this next question of mine, but if you would like to add something to that, then what do we do if I don't have translations, or the translations don't exist? So you kind of covered that, but if you could, there is anything else to be added to this.
Yep. So there's situations where translations won't exist. Either somebody hasn't made the translation, or if you're using a third-party service, there's a turnaround time where they may still be working on the translation. So you only have it in one language, but not all of the languages that you would want. And in this case, you'd want to look into setting up Sitecore's language fallbacks and really understanding how what language you should show in the absence of end user's preferred language. Is there a similar language that could be used? For instance, if you've configured a site to use US English, and then you have a Canada site that has Canadian English and Canadian French. If the French Canadian version doesn't exist, is it acceptable to fall back to the Canadian English? And if that Canadian English doesn't exist, is it acceptable to fall back to the US English? Sometimes the client is perfectly acceptable falling back from, say, in this example, French Canadian to French English. Just kind of understanding that their clientele, there's a pretty good chance they'll be able to decipher that. Sometimes, however, the clients won't want any fallback at all. This is usually, or we hear about this when there's legal requirements, where it's better for them to not show any content rather than to show content in the wrong language. So again, this is something that can be solved a number of different ways. However, planning and discussions up front will allow you to pick the right option on that.
Right. So, like, I think this clears a lot of basics regarding Sitecore globalization. Let's talk of a little some challenges or some pitfalls, which we might face if we are starting off with Sitecore globalization for some of our client solutions.
Sure. So this is a big topic, and I'm just going to cover off a little bit on what I've seen or what I've run into in doing a couple of these sites. So first of all, when you're building out a global site in Sitecore, odds are the clients never had all of their web properties under one roof before, under one code base. So they're going to need to make some process changes, and they're going to need to have some buy-in from various users. So buy-in from the stakeholders is a big issue. We've seen a number of times where we would work directly with a US team, for example, and they would be building out an EU site, and the EU stakeholders wouldn't necessarily be involved up until the end when you get into the UAT process, and then they kind of are involved in that process, and they're realizing at that point that not all of the requirements fit their needs or aren't applicable to their market. So whatever you can do to get buy-in early from the stakeholders, or keep the various teams supporting the various regions in the conversation as you go, so that there are no surprises at the end. The kind of irony is that you're building a global website to better manage and support multiple people in multiple regions across the world, but the client doesn't always solve that themselves. So that's something that as a Sitecore partner, you should really look at solving, make sure that you are helping your main client to complete a site that meets all of the needs. And if nothing else, then you won't be surprised at the end when you start getting testing done by other regions or other markets. Another challenge or pitfall that you'll run into is, how do you approach varying requirements in different regions? So if you build out this really cool widget for the US site, but due to how businesses run in the EU or in another region, that needs to change, or that has different data requirements for that region. How do you build in that flexibility so that you're not essentially supporting two completely different set of component libraries? One approach, obviously, before you know what that is, you'll need to hear from that other region, and you'll need to know their needs. So that kind of goes back to that comment around buy-in from the various stakeholders. But understanding and having a method in place to allow you to vary the components used site by site, or vary the requirements within those components on a site level, is something that you'll want to discuss and have a plan for essentially before you need to do that. It may also have an impact on how you would structure the content tree, or how content entry would happen. So the building in this variation could propagate through all of the levels of the project, and really into how it gets maintained. There are some that you could probably discuss and make some modifications on all of the regions affected, or talk to the client about maybe rethinking. And then there are some that are much more strict. And essentially, of course, we've seen a lot of discussion around the GDPR. There's some specific requirements around that. Very little flexibility for changing those requirements. So you will see this in a global site. You'll need to solve it both for your current project, but also if you're building a global solution, the idea would be that you could expand that out to other regions as you go. So how do you expand the splitting of requirements for components, or handling new requirements that are specific to a region without duplicating your code base, or having multiple components supporting multiple features? Another pitfall or concern, or something to look at that I've totally skimmed over in this discussion, is the server and infrastructure. Obviously, you want to serve content to users from a server as close to them as possible. You wouldn't want users in India to necessarily have to make a request to a server based in the US. There's been a lot of discussion around how you can expand the infrastructure across multiple regions. There's a couple of different ways to do that. Either, moving the entire infrastructure, content delivery, content authoring, all of the other servers and all, or just the delivery servers so that your end users have the best performance without kind of the overhead of having the complete Sitecore infrastructure duplicated across. There are pros and cons to each in different levels of maturity on the client's IT department to handle that, but it's something that you're definitely going to want to at least address early on because that could impact your site. If nothing else, if your site's slow to load in one region because they need to make a request to the other side of the planet, it might be down to the fact that it doesn't matter how good your site is. If it takes forever to load, you'll need to look at some other options. Another thing to keep in mind is we talked a lot about translations and translations of content within Sitecore. And that's not the only thing that could be quote unquote translated. There are things such as dates and formatting of dates that you'll need to vary. Obviously, within the content, that's easy to update, but a lot of times those dates come in from third-party systems or are data points in a database somewhere that are getting exposed. So having the ability to vary the formatting of that. Along the same lines, currency is always unique. If you are supporting a site in multiple regions, and if it has say a product catalog or whatnot with currency, how are you going to handle currency when it's shown in another region? Are you going to put some sort of currency conversion system in place? Are you always going to show it in your kind of your root currency? And these are questions that need to be asked. They can't be answered ahead of time because it's really dependent on what the client's doing with that currency. Are they allowing e-commerce purchases on there? If so, is the currency conversion coming from them? It needs to match up with another system on there. How often does that get updated? The other thing to look at is SEO and analytics. Like I said, you'll usually see all of these sites coming together for the first time. In these types of projects, you'll see drastic changes to the layout of one or more of the region or country specific sites. And that will impact SEO and analytics. A lot of times, each of the different regions will have been maintaining their own analytics. They'll be maintaining their own set of goals and success criteria as they go. And now bringing them in under one roof, even if your site's performing better than the previous site, just the optics into those results may look different, or the reports may need to be structured in a different way. And that's really part of how you need to approach the analytics from that global perspective and make sure that everyone understands what they're getting at the end of the day. The final point to talk through is coordination of maintenance tasks. When you're supporting and maintaining a site in a single region, it's very easy to determine what off hours is in order to do a deployment or any sort of maintenance. When you're supporting a site across the globe, it gets a lot more difficult because one team's off hours might be the busy hours for another region. So some of the things to look at is go back to the analytics, see what the lowest impact time is, just kind of across all of your regions and all of your supported markets, and identify that. Knowing when you'll have the least amount of risk is a really good starting point. Aside from that, in the setup phase of the project, looking at what can you do in order to isolate changes, or is there a way to roll out changes market by market or region by region. Obviously, if all of your content is served off, a single set of CD servers, it's much more difficult to do. But if you're starting to put CD servers around the world, is there a way you can structure that so that you could deploy to one area in off hours and then another area in off hours and their off hours, so you can roll this out? It also has other benefits around testing. You're not deploying to the entire world at once, so one region might have a little bit of time to kind of validate what's going out there. So those were some of the challenges and pitfalls we've seen from kind of our experience. I'm sure there's more on there, but really just understanding the process, making sure the client's buying in from that, making sure that you hear from the various stakeholders along the way instead of right at the end is generally just going to make your life a whole lot easier.
So a very common scenario that as Sitecore partners base is about upgrading an existing website. So what do I need to do if I need to consider globalization there? Do I need to have a full rewrite of all the components and things, or can I reuse some of the things and still have globalization work?
Sure. So this is a very good question. It comes up a lot, and it's something that there's no right answer for, in my opinion. You'll need to evaluate where you're at and where you want to go. And I think the big first step on that is, if you're doing a rewrite, is this, or if you're updating an existing site, is this something where the goal of it is to get them into another region so that they can support that region while they build out something more specific to that region? Sometimes it's a short-term project and you want to invest minimal effort into it so you could spend more time on the next project that will better fill those examples. Assuming that it's not just a quick set of changes here, what you probably want to do is look at the content, how it's going to be reused, what the onboarding process is for a new region or a new site, a new language, and see what those pain points are. Once you identify those, then you can start restructuring content to better support that, or restructuring the code for that. A common way to kind of handle that is, as you go, as you touch features or components and make them be able to support all of the languages and regions, at that point, that's when you would essentially refactor the content for those, maybe update it to look similar to the content tree or the content structure we discussed sooner, but not try to address all of them at once if they're not needed. So this way, you can continue to make incremental upgrades to an existing site that starts that allows them to start supporting other regions, but you don't have to essentially touch everything at once if there's no immediate value the client would gain from that. The other part of this is, if you're maintaining existing sites or making some incremental updates to that, and all of a sudden you're delving into supporting multiple regions or multiple languages, all of the process discussions that we talked about in the previous slide all of a sudden become very relevant, because you're going to deliver work for another region that may not be in there. And it's actually can be more difficult sometimes to change the process mid-project versus defining the project when you're, or defining the process when you're starting a brand new project. Aside from that, just keep in mind where you want to be and where the most bang for the buck is when you're putting effort in to making updates.
Yeah. So I think those are the questions that we had. Now it's an open table for everyone, others who are joining as participants. If you have any questions, please go on. And also for the viewers who are viewing this live right now, if you have any questions, post it to us on Twitter with the hashtag #Sitecore Globalization. and we will hand those questions over to Dan for answer them for us.
Yeah. I think till the time I don't see any questions being asked on the Twitter handle right now. Then I have a question. Yeah. So we are talking about different regions where content author they work from different regions. Now, how does Sitecore, like if I want to have globalization or my language changed onto the content editor? For example, I have content author working from a German region or someone working from maybe a Germany. Is it possible that the whole content editor can be made language specific?
Yeah, so there is a lot of English text in the content editor by default. I'm sure we've all seen that. There is the ability to vary the content in there to other languages, but supporting that and setting that up would be part of the initial project creation. Generally a good practice to allow people to view the content in in their native language that they would understand the best. You'll get the best results. You'll have the fewest amount of questions come back to you. Another that kind of leads to another really good question is, or a topic is, if you are providing any sort of documentation or training material, that's something that will probably also have to be translated or addressed or propagated out, not just the content that's present to the end users, but any of the content authors using the system will need to understand how to use it. And that may entail translating technical documentation, which I think there's probably a larger discussion needed for how that is best accomplished. So.
Okay. Then I had another question. Yeah, we talked about the translation tools, right? Like there are services, there are translation tools. But have you heard any talk or any things about Sitecore doing that? Yeah, Sitecore is building SXA, coming up with Sitecore Commerce and all those modules out of the box. Have you heard something like Sitecore coming up with its own out of the box translation tools?
I have not heard that or explored that. I have explored integrating with other third-party systems. I don't know if you're asking because you have heard something. I would be very curious if they did have a service to support that.
I haven't heard about it anything, but just if we have come across some
Sure.
out of the box from Sitecore. We're just checking the hashtag. Yeah.
Till then, the teammates who have joined in, any questions regarding Sitecore Globalization? You can go ahead.
I think it's you can wrap it up then, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So let's just brief about Sugin. We are looking for speakers on Sugin. I will share. We can be a speaker if we want to present something.
So then I'll take screen sharing from you here.
Yeah. So this is the website, and as I said, we're looking for speakers. If you are one of the speaker, if you want to share your knowledge on Sitecore on learnings, you can just reach out to our contact form and then just fill this form, and we will be in touch with you for presenting your topic on the survey. Maybe it's a good time.
Right. So then, I'm presenting on this topic to help other Sitecore community enthusiasts to learn, and also thank you to the members who joined in and all those viewers who are currently watching it on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining in on a weekend, just for learning something new. And yeah, I think Nan, you covered Sitecore Globalization basics very well. So thank you for sharing that information with all of us.
Thank you for having me on this. It was a great opportunity and really appreciate it. So hats off to you too.
Okay. See you then. Bye.
Right. Till the next session.